All right, here we go. Phase 2 of the 40 series launch. Today we're talking about the actual RTX 4080 16 gigabyte, not to be confused with the fake 4080 12 gigabyte, which is now apparently going to become the 4070 Ti. We all saw that coming a mile away. Anyway, this is it right here. Let's see how it compares to its little brother, technically now, the 3090 and 3090 Ti versus the 3080 and the 4090. So there's lots of numbers. Numbers, I'm so sick of numbers. All right, speaking of numbers, let's get paid.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. We're showing you graphics card, but inventory sucks. Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
All right, so the RTX 4080, it's a weird card in the sense that it's quite cut down from the RTX 4090. Now remember, this was the first launch where we had the 90 series kind of come out first with full benchmarks, full charts, the whole deal, and then the 80 series. Whereas in the past, they've launched the 80 series card, like the 3080, with the 3090 launching a month later, and then the 70, well, 3080, 3070 first, then 90, and then down. So this time we kind of got to see like what a nearly uncut die looks like for the 4 nanometer Ada Lovelace. But if we look at this one here, the 4090 has 16,384 CUDA cores versus the 4080's 9,728. It's a significant cut down versus the 4090, which leads you to believe that there's room there for a 4080 Ti. But when you start to look at the performance though, it starts to become more difficult to squeeze a card in there. But if you did, the price point at least would sort of make sense in its performance range. Because remember, this is a $1,199 card for the FE. Custom cards like the Strix and the Neptune and all the other, like the Tough and all that, are more than likely going to cost more because the AIBs always charge more for that custom board that they design. It costs them more to make it too. But the 4080 uses the exact same cooler as the RTX 4090. It has basically the exact same PCB layout, which means just like the 3090 and 3080, you're more than likely gonna see universal blocks that work for both. The difference is like there's just less RAM available to it. There's also less power available to it because this is a 320 watt TDP card. So we're not gonna talk about the difference between TGP and TDP, but TDP, we're talking about here at least is total board power, TBP, at 320 watts. So before we sort of talk about the buying power or the value of an RTX 4080, you have to see how it compares. Comparing this card is difficult, in my opinion, to find exactly which cards to compare it to. So I compared it to the best AMD offering prior to the 7900 XTX coming out, which is the 6950 XT Red Devil, which is the highest tiered AMD card that we currently have. We compared it to the 3080, the 3090 Ti, which when it launched was a $2,000 card. Obviously you're able to get it for as low as $1,050 if you're lucky, because they're pretty much gone now at this point. And the 4090. Kind of seeing where the 4080 slots in there, because if you look at all those price points and all those performance points, then you can kind of determine the future of what might be slotting and where and when. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the charts. no surprise, I don't even know why I include 1080p in any of these anymore. 1080p is just bottlenecked across the board, with the exception of Shadow of the Tomb Raider RT. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider actually scales really, really well with the, well, it shows like the most linear curve you can possibly see in any title. That's just because of the fact that the engine cap is a bit higher. Now, the 4080 and the 4090, and heck, even the 3090 Ti and the 3080 in some, pretty much reaches a 1080p engine bottleneck in pretty much every single title. But I still show it because it's interesting to see when sometimes a lower tiered card will score higher in a lower resolution than a higher tiered card. It's because I think it's smacking the limiter a little less hard than, say, the higher tiered card, so you get a better average FPS. But if you look at min max, and it tells a different story. 1440p, 4080 is still hitting the bottleneck or the engine cap, or even bottlenecking the CPU, depending on the title, depending on your settings as well. Now, all my settings are pretty much max, because I like to put as much, it's like a dyno run for a car. You put as much load on it as you can, and that tells you a big story about its performance. But obviously in 1440p in certain titles, we're still hitting that engine cap, which means that the 4080 is still an amazing 4K card. Now, they've obviously touted the 4090 as being an 8K gaming card, not as hard as AMD did in their marketing material, but anyway, an 8K gaming capable card, which means the 4080 should obviously be able to have no problems playing 4K. The only title that brings these graphics cards to their knees is Cyberpunk with RT on and no sort of upscaling. So in Cyberpunk 2077 with RT on, no DLSS or anything, 4K, 30 FPS, 62 FPS though in 1440. Like it's where we finally start to see that 60 FPS, like kind of a minimum gamer spec, 60 FPS or higher, or go home, but 96 FPS in 1080p. But DLSS obviously would bring those scores much higher. And then once you turn off RT, and we're talking 191 FPS at 1080p, 128 in 1440. Now, Cyberpunk is still a very big, difficult game to render. But let's talk about power draw for a second here, because that is probably what's on everyone's mind given the fiasco that is still taking place with the RTX 4090. Side note, NVIDIA did say that there are 2 different manufacturers for their 4-to-1 plug, and it's looking like one of the manufacturers specifically is the one that is kind of continuously having the problem. So sounds like they're diving deeper in there. But the RTX 4080 comes with a 3-to-1. What that means is it's 3 8-pin PCI Express to the single 12-volt high power adapter. So obviously that means its power draw and its power is limited, much lower than an RTX 4090. Now this is a 3090. 4090 is actually in my system at home. I've been running it, trying to see if I can't get the problem to recreate, but so far so good. But we're not seeing that kind of power draw. So the 4080, had they launched the 4080 first, it would have been a much more positive story, because I would be surprised if a 4080 was actually able to melt the plug. Now it could still, if there's a defect in the plug causing the problem, not necessarily the power draw. However, the 100% power limit on the RTX 4080 is 320 watts. That's the same as what the 3080 was. Remember the 3090 was 350, and then 3090 Ti was 450, and that's why we saw the 12-volt high power plug on a 3090 Ti. Not with the 4-pin sideband, not the standard one without the 4-pin. So under normal gaming conditions though, like for instance, putting up Heaven, which is just a DX11 rasterization benchmark, it was like low 200 watts. Like it wasn't even hitting 250 watts. Now this is putting it back into like 20 series power range. Remember 20 series 2080 Ti maxed at 250 watt. That was the TDP norm for years, was 250 watts. So we weren't even seeing it hit 250 watts. So then we put it into Port Royal, which is where we know it's gonna turns on all the ray tracing features, reflections, global illumination, the whole deal, and it really puts a load on those RT cores, and we saw it hit a little bit over 300 watts. In fact, it would peg the power limit kind of periodically at around 311 watts. At least that's what was visible to us. It might have actually been hitting 320 so quickly we didn't actually notice it. But again, 300, low 300s. And then I went into like Forza, 4K, and all these, the gaming test was at 4K, because 4K obviously is gonna load up all the RAM, it's gonna put a harder load on the GPU. And again, starts out in the low 200s, and then it goes up to like the 230s, and then it hits around the 250s towards the end of the run. But even then, didn't exceed 260 watts at the most. In fact, this would have been an amazing story for a launch for NVIDIA. Instead, they chose to go with the RTX 4090, which ended up being a bit of a shit show. Now the RTX 4090's performance is absolutely bonkers. But if we take a look at where the 4080 is landing with like over 7,000 less CUDA cores, let me put this in perspective for you. The CUDA core count difference between a 4090 and a 4080 is the same number of CUDA cores that you find in the 4070 Ti/4080 12 gig. That amount of CUDA cores is how much more is in the 4090 versus the 4080, yet you look at the performance, it's not that big of a spread versus that gap in performance. So if you take the percentage of CUDA cores found in the 4090 and the 4080, it's not a linear gap. It's not scaling linearly. It also goes to show how much power it takes to push over 16,000 CUDA cores. And that's also why when DeBauer did his overclocking stuff with it and used the custom voltage controller that he soldered on and all that, he found that the moment he touches voltage and pushes it up even just a little bit, how it starts to exceed 800 watts. At the end of the day, the 4080, although the price is still pretty pricey at $1,200, if you were to compare it to the 2080 Ti, which I kind of wish I had time to do the benchmarks on, and I'll still probably do that and include it in some of the AIB testing here. The performance per watt and performance per dollar is going to be astronomical, which is a good thing. We like to see more performance for the same price. The only thing is, we kind of had that little weirdness of the 30 series in between these two families of graphics cards, which just jacked up all of the pricing and stuff, because had those cards ever truly existed in their lifetime for their MSRPs, like, you know, the $799 MSRP that you would find a 3080 for, or was it $699? I think it was $699. Whatever. That would have been absolutely insane. Like, it'd still be a heck of a deal if you can get a 3080 for that price. In fact, you can get 3080 down $700, brand new, still available on the market. I looked before this video, there's still Zotacs and stuff available for that price. It's just kind of unfortunate that they chose not to launch this one first, because I think it might have made a different impact on the way things are looking for NVIDIA. But at the end of the day, performance, fantastic. Price, subjective, but it's not the first time they've launched an 80 series card at $1,200, although to be fair, it was a 2080 Ti that was $1,200, and if they have launched a 4080 Ti, given the gap between the 4090 and the 4080, if they do a 4080 Ti, it's gonna have to be around $1,450 or so dollars. Which would be weird because NVIDIA doesn't typically launch with the 50. They launch like 99s everywhere. The temperatures are insane. It's the exact same cooler that you would find on a 4090, but with that TDP we talked about, the 320 watt limit, the fact that it's not even hitting 320 watts in most instances means that it runs extremely cool. In fact, the fan curve, you can never hear the damn thing, even with the side panel open, and we were hitting like 55C, 56C, in any of my average testing. And then in Port Royal, if I just let it go, it'll hit 61, 62C. It'll lock itself at 27, 75 megahertz, and it doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't change whether it hits power limited, and it is voltage limited the entire time, just like the 4090. And you don't see the first megahertz bin drop or boost bin drop until it hits 61C, which then drops at 15 megahertz. Remember, each bin is 15 megahertz. It's the first time I've been able to put in a card, touch nothing in MSI Afterburner, have it be cool, have it be quiet, and have the frame rates or the megahertz engine speed just be locked. In fact, it goes to show, Phil and I talked about this, and when we talked about the temps and stuff, and I said, man, that's nuts. And Phil goes, you know what that means to me? It means it could have been smaller. But I think in terms of manufacturing, to have essentially the same cooler with the only difference being the backplate that has 4080 etched into it versus 4090, it was probably a cost move to just manufacture a crap ton of the same cooler and plop them on the same. Because remember, this is a 3080 versus a 3090 right here. So as you can see, very different form factors. This could have been the size of a 4080 right here. But again, in terms of manufacturing, it more than likely would have cost more to have two sizes like this. Anyway, there you go. I'm curious at this price point, those that were holding off from 4090, given the fact that I would be surprised if we see connectors melting with this card given its current power draw, because the high power draw of a 4090 through any sort of a defect in the wires and stuff would only show itself obviously as power scales up, the issue will become more apparent. At this power, at this price point, at this performance, are you ready to buy this card now? Or are you afraid of it now because the 4090 has put you off on the whole concept of their power connectors? Anyway, sound off down below, guys. We'll see you probably tomorrow with an AIB version of this because, spoiler, they're just as big as the 4090s. I got a Strix card that's like this big. So unnecessary. But anyway, They all share the same parts, so I guess that means blocks and coolers and stuff will be fun to shop for because it'll be like one size fits all.